A young man with a grave manner and something malicious in his eye, apparently a first secretary of the embassy, informed Cosmo shortly after they had been made known to each other that the wife of the general would not naturally be received in Vienna society, and that this was the secret of Bubna sticking to his Italian command so long, even now when really all the excitement was over. Of course he was very much in love with his wife. He used to give her balls twice a week at the expense of the Turin municipality. Old Bubna understood the art of pillaging to perfection. But apart from that, he was a parfait galant homme and an able soldier. Bonaparte had a very great liking for him. Bubna was the only friend Bonaparte had in this room. He meant sympathy as man for man. Years ago, when Bubna was in Paris, he got on very well with the Emperor. Bonaparte knew how to flatter a man. It was worth while to sit up half the night to hear Bubna talking about Bonaparte. "I am posting you up like this," concluded the secretary, "because I see you are in the intimacy of the Marquis and of Madame de Monteveso here." He went away then to talk to somebody else, and presently Madame de Monteveso, passing close to Cosmo, whispered to him, "Stay to the last," and went on without waiting for his answer. Cosmo, amongst all the groups engaged in animated conversation, felt rather lonely, totally estranged from the ideas those people were expressing to each other. He could not possibly be in sympathy with the fears and the hopes strictly personal, and with the royalist legitimist enthusiasms of these advocates of an order of things that had been buried for a quarter of a century, and now was paraded like a rouged and powdered corpse putting on a swagger of life and revenge. Then he reflected that in this room, at any rate, it was probably nothing but scandalous gossip and trivial talk of futile intrigues. There was no need for him to be indignant. He was even amused at himself, and looking about him in a kindlier frame of mind, he perceived that the person nearest to him was that strange girl with the round eyes. She had kept perfectly still on her uncomfortable stool, like a captured savage. Her green flounced skirt was spread on each side of the seat. The bodice of her dress, which was black, was cut low. Her bare arms were youthfully red and immature. Her hair was done up smoothly and pulled up from her forehead in the manner of the portraits of the 15th century. "Why do they dress her in this bizarre manner?" thought Cosmo. It couldn't be Adèle's conception, perhaps of the Count himself. Yet that didn't seem likely. Perhaps it was her own atrocious taste. But if so, it ought to have been repressed. He reflected that there could be nothing improper in him talking to the niece of the house. He would try his conversational Italian. With the feeling of venturing on a doubtful experiment, he approached her from the back, sat down at her elbow, and waited. She could not possibly remain unaware of him being there. At last she turned her head for a point-blank stare, and once she had her eyes on him, she never attempted to take them away. Cosmo uttered carefully a complimentary phrase about her dress, which was received in perfect silence. Her carmine lips remained as still as her round black eyes for quite a long time. Suddenly, in a low tone, with an accent which surprised Cosmo, but which he supposed to be Piedmontese, and with a sort of spiteful triumph, she said, "I knew very well it would suit me. You think it does?" Her whole personality had such an aggressive mien that Cosmo, startled and amused, hastened to say, "Undoubtedly," lest she should fly at his eyes. She showed him her teeth in a grin of savage complacency, and the subject seemed exhausted. Cosmo set himself the task to daunt her by a steady gaze. In less than 2 seconds he regretted his venture, He felt certain that she would not be the one to look away first. There was not the slightest doubt about that. In order to cover his retreat, he let his eyes wander vaguely about the room, smiled agreeably, and said, "Your uncle is not here. Shall I have the pleasure of seeing him this evening?" "No," she said, "you won't see him this evening. But he knows you have been here this morning." This was, strictly speaking, news to Cosmo, but he said at once, and with great indifference, "Why shouldn't he? Probably Madame de Monteveso has told him." "I used to know your aunt when she was younger than you are, Signorina. How do you know how old I am?" Cosmo asked himself if she would ever wink those black eyes of hers. "I know that you are not 100 years old." This struck her as humorous, because there was a sound as of a faint giggle, which, generally speaking, is a silly kind of sound, but in her case had a disturbing quality. It was followed by the hoarse declaration, "Aunt didn't. I told Uncle. I looked a lot at you in the morning. Why didn't you look at me?" "I was afraid of being indiscreet," said Cosmo readily, concealing his astonishment. "What silliness," she commented scornfully. "And this evening, too. I was looking at you all the time, and you did nothing but look at all those witches here, one after another." "I find all the ladies in the room perfectly charming," said Cosmo. "You lie. I suppose you do nothing else from morning till night." "I am sorry you have such a bad opinion of me, but it being what it is, hadn't I better go away?" "Directly I set eyes on you, I knew you were one of that sort." "And did you impart your opinion of me to your uncle?" asked Cosmo. He could be no more offended with that girl than if she had been an unmannerly animal. Her peculiar stare remained unchanged, but her general expression softened for a moment. "No, but I took care to tell him that you were a very handsome gentleman." "You are a very handsome gentleman." What surprised Cosmo was not the downright statement, but the thought that flashed through his mind that it was as dreadful as being told that one was good to eat. For a time he stared without any thought of unwinking competition. He was not amused, distinctly not. He asked, "Where were you born?" "How can I tell? In the mountains, I suppose. Somewhere where you will never go. How can it possibly concern you?" Cosmo offered his apology for his indiscretion, and she received it with a sort of uncomprehending scorn. She said after a pause, "None of those witches, young or old, ever speak to me. And even you didn't want to speak to me. You only spoke to me." "Oh, no. I know why you spoke to me." "Why did I speak to you?" asked Cosmo thoughtfully. "Won't you tell me?" Upon the firm roundness of that high-colored face came a subtle change which suggested something in the nature of cunning, and the rough, somewhat veiled voice came from between the red lips which had no more charm or life than the painted lips carved in a piece of wood. "If I were to tell you, you would be as wise as myself." "Where would be the harm of me being as wise as yourself?" said Cosmo, trying to be playful, but somehow missing the tone of playfulness so completely that he was struck by his failure himself. "If you were as wise as myself, you would never come to this house again, and I don't want you to stay away," was the answer, delivered in a hostile tone. Cosmo said, "You don't? Well, at any rate, it can't be because of kindness, so I don't thank you for it." He said this with extreme amiability. Becoming aware that people were beginning to leave, he observed out of the corner of his eye that nobody went away without glancing in their direction. Then the departure of Lady William caused a general stir, and gave Cosmo the occasion to get up and move away. Lady William gave him a gracious nod, and the Marquis, coming up to him, introduced him at the last moment to General Count Bubna, just as that distinguished person was making ready to take his wife away. Everybody was standing up, and for the first time Cosmo felt himself completely unobserved. Obeying a discreet sign of the Countess de Monteveso, he moved unaffectedly in the direction of a closed door. The white and gold door he remembered well from his morning visit. When he had got near to it, and within reach of the handle, he turned about. He had the view of the guests' backs as they moved slowly out. Adele looked over her shoulder for a moment with an affirmative nod. He understood it, hesitated no longer, opened the door, and slipped through without, so far as he could judge, being seen by anybody. It was as he had thought. He found himself in Madame de Monteveso's boudoir, in which he had been received that morning. Chapter 4. He shut the door behind him gently, and remained between it and the screen. He had expected to be followed at once by Adele. What could be detaining her? But he remembered the remarkable proportions of that suite of reception rooms. He had seen some apartments in Paris, but nothing quite so long as that. The old Marquis would no doubt conduct the little Madame Bubna to the very door of the ante-room. The ambassador of the Most Christian King owed that attention to the representative of his Apostolic Majesty and commander-in-chief of the Austrian troops. This was the exact form which his thought took. The Christian King, the Apostolic Majesty, all those submerged heads were bobbing up out of the subsiding flood. He pictured them to himself in their mental simplicity and with their grand air, the Marquis magnificent and aging, and the dutiful daughter by his side with her radiant head and her divine form. It was impossible to believe that these two had also been submerged at one time. All those people were mere playthings, reflected Cosmo without a pang. But who or what was playing with them, he thought further, boldly, and remained for a moment as if amused by the marvelousness of it, in the manner of people watching the changes on the stage. But what could have become of them? She might next moment be opening the door. Could she have made him stay behind because she wanted to speak with him alone? Why, yes, obviously. Cosmo did not ask himself what she wanted to talk to him about. It was no wonder that he felt. It was a subtle emotion resembling impatience for the arrival of a promised felicity of an indefinite kind. All this was by no means poignant. It was merely delightfully disturbing. I shall have a tete-a-tete, that's clear, he thought, as he advanced into the room. The air all around him was delightfully warm. Whatever she would have to say would be wonderful because of her voice. He would look her in the face. She did not intimidate him, and it was impossible to have too much of that. After all, he thought, immensely amused, it was only Adele. His mental monologue was cut short by the shock of perceiving, seated on the painted sofa, a man who was looking at him in perfect silence and immobility. The fact was that Count Elion, having come into the boudoir sooner than his wife had expected him to do, had directed his eyes to the screen ever since he had heard the opening and the shutting of the door. One of his hands was resting on his thigh. The other hung down holding negligently a number of some gazette which was partly resting on the floor. Though not very big, that piece of paper attracted Cosmo's eyes, and it was in this way that he became aware of the brown fingers covered with rings, of the gaunt legs encased in silk stockings, and of the crossed feet in dress shoes with gold buckles, almost before he took in the impression of the broad but lean face, which seemed to have been stained with walnut juice, long enough for the stain to have worn down thin, letting the native pallor come through. The same tint extended to the bald top of the head. But what was really extraordinary was the hair. 2 patches of black behind each temple, obviously dyed. The man, as to whose identity Cosmo could have no doubt, got up, displaying the full length of his bony frame, in a tense and soldierly stiffness associated with cross-belts, and a cowhide knapsack on the back. A grenadier, thought Cosmo, startled by this unexpected meeting, which also caused him profound annoyance, as though he had been induced to walk into a trap. What he could not understand was why the man should make that grimace at him. It convulsed his whole physiognomy, involving his lips, his cheeks, and his very eyes in a sort of spasm. The most awful thing was that it stayed there. "Why, it's a smile," thought Cosmo with sudden relief. It was so sudden that it broke into a smile without any particular volition of his own. Thereupon the face of Count Elion recovered its normal aspect, and Cosmo heard his voice for the first time. It proceeded from the depths of his chest. It was resonant and blurred and portentous, with an effect of stiffness somehow in accord with the man's bearing. It informed Cosmo that Count Elion had been waiting in the Countess's boudoir on purpose to make his acquaintance, while in the man's eyes there was a watchfulness, as though he had been uttering a momentous disclosure, and was anxious as to its effect. A perfectly horizontal, jet-black mustache, underlining the nose of Count Elion, which was broad at the base and thin at the end, suggested comic possibilities in that head, which had too much individuality to be looked upon by Cosmo simply as the head of Adele's husband, and Cosmo hardly looked at it in that light. His hold on that fact was slippery. He preserved his equanimity perfectly, and said that he himself had wondered whether he would have the pleasure of making the Count's acquaintance that evening. Both men sat down. "My occupations kept me late tonight," said the Count. "The courier came in." He pointed with his fingers to the Gazette lying on the floor, and Cosmo asked if there were any news. "In the Gazette? No. At least nothing interesting. The world is full of vanities and scandals, rumors of conspiracies. Very poor stuff. I don't know any of those people the papers mention every day. That's more my wife's affair. For years now she has spent about 10 months of every year in Paris or near Paris. I am a provincial. My interests are in the orphanage I have founded in my native country. I am also building an asylum for—" He got up suddenly, approached the mantelpiece in 3 strides, and turned round exactly like a soldier in the ranks of a company changing front. He was wearing a blue coat cut away in front and having a long skirt, something recalling the cut of a uniform, though the material was fine and there was a good deal of gold lace about it, as also on his white satin waistcoat. Cosmo recalled the vague story he had heard about Count de Monteveso having served in more than one army before being given the rank of general by the King of Piedmont. The man had been drilled. Cosmo wondered whether he had ever been caned. He was a military adventurer of the commonest type. Some of them have been known to return with a fortune got by pillage and intrigue, and possibly even by real talents of a sort in the service of Oriental courts, full of splendors and crimes, tyrannies and treacheries and dark dramas of ambition or love. He is the very thing, Cosmo exclaimed mentally, gazing at the stiff figure leaning against the mantelpiece. Of course he got his fortune in India. What was remarkable about him was that he had managed to get away with his plunder, or at any rate a part of it, considerable enough to enable him to make a figure in the world and marry Adèle d'Armand in England. That was only because of the Revolution. In royal France he would not have had the ghost of a chance. And even as it was, only the odious laxity of London society in accepting rich strangers had given him his opportunity. Cosmo, forcing himself to envisage this dubious person as the husband of Adèle, felt very angry with the light-minded tolerance extended to foreigners, characteristic of a certain part of London society. It was perfectly outrageous. "Where the devil can my wife be?" Those words made Cosmo start, though they had not been uttered very loudly. Almost mechanically he answered, "I don't know," and noticed that Count Elion was staring at him in a curiously unintelligent manner. "I was really asking myself," muttered the latter, and stirred uneasily, without, however, taking his elbow off the mantelpiece. "It's a natural thought, since we are, God knows why, kept waiting for her here. I wasn't aware I had spoken. Living for many years amongst people who didn't understand any European language, I had hundreds of them in my place in Sind. I got into the habit of talking aloud, strange as it may appear to you." "Yes," said Cosmo with an air of innocence. "I suppose one acquires all sorts of strange habits in those distant countries. We, in England, have a class of men who return from India enriched. They are called nabobs. Some of them have most objectionable habits. Unluckily, they're mere wealth." "There is nothing to compare with wealth," interrupted the other in a soldierly voice, and paused, then continued in the same tone of making a verbal report. "When I was in England, I had the privilege to know many people of position. They were very kind to me. They didn't seem to think lightly of wealth." Each phrase came curt, detached, but it was evident that the man did not mean to be offensive. Those statements originated obviously in sincere conviction, and after the Count had uttered them, there appeared on his forehead the horizontal wrinkles of unintelligent worry. Cosmo asked himself whether the man before him was not really very stupid. Under the elevated eyebrows, his eyes looked worn and empty of all thought. "Lots of money, I mean," Monsieur de Monteveso began again, "not your savings and scrapings. Money that one acquires boldly, and enough of it to be profuse with." "Is he going to treat me to vulgar boasting?" thought Cosmo. He wished that Adèle would come in and interrupt this tete-a-tete, which was so very different from the one he had been expecting. "I dare say money is very useful," he assented with airy scorn, which he thought might put an end to the subject. But his interlocutor persisted. "You can't know anything about it," he affirmed, then added unexpectedly, "Money will give you even ideas, lots of ideas. The worst of it is that any one of them may turn out damnable." "Well, yes, there is of course danger in money, but what of that?" "It can scarcely be, if it is used for good works as you seem to use it," said Cosmo with polite indifference. He meant it to be final, but Count de Monteveso was not to be suppressed. "It leads one into worries," he said. "For instance, that orphanage of mine. It is really a very large place. I am trying to be a benefactor to my native province, but I want it to be in my own way. Well, since the Restoration, the priests are trying to get hold of it. They want to turn it to the glory of God and to the service of religion. I have seen enough of all sorts of religions not to know what that means. No sooner had the king entered Paris than the bishop wrote to me pointing out that there was no chapel, and suggesting that I should build one and appoint a chaplain. That bishop is... He threw up his head suddenly, and Cosmo became aware of the presence of Adele, without having heard even the rustle of her dress. He stood up hastily. There was a short silence. "I see the acquaintance is made," said Adele, looking from one to the other. Her eyes lingered on Cosmo and then turned to her husband. "I didn't know you would be already here. I had to help my father to his room. I would have come at once here, but he detained me." Again she turned to Cosmo. "You will pardon me. I found Count Elion here. I have not been alone for a minute," said Cosmo. "You owe me no apologies. I was delighted to make your husband's acquaintance, even if you were not here to introduce us to each other." This was said in English, and Count Elion by the mantelpiece waited till Cosmo had finished before he asked, "Where's Clelia?" "I have sent her to bed," said Countess de Monteveso. "Elion, my father would like to see you this evening." "I am at the orders of Monsieur le Marquis." The grenadier-like figure at the mantelpiece did not stir, and those words were followed only by a slight twitch in the muscles of the face, which might have had a sardonic intention. "Tonight, at once," he repeated, "but with Mr. Latham here?" "Pray don't mind me. I am going away directly," said Cosmo. "It is getting late. In Italy it is never late. I hope to find you here when I return. As the husband of a daughter of the house of Darman, I know what is due to the name of Latham. Am I really expected at once?" Adele moved forward a step or two, speaking rapidly. "There has been some news from Elba, or about Elba, which gives a certain concern to my father. As you have been, to the public knowledge, in direct touch with people from Elba, my father would like to have your opinion." Count Elion changed his attitude, and leaning his shoulders against the mantelpiece, addressed himself to Cosmo. "It was the most innocent thing in the world. It was something about the project for the exploitation of the island of Pianosa. Napoleon sent his treasurer here to get in touch with a banker. I am a man of affairs. The banker consulted me as a man who knew the spot. It's true I know the spot, but if you hear it said that it is because of my relations with the Dey of Algiers, pray don't believe it. I am in no way in touch with the Barbary States." He made a step forward, and then another, and stood still. "You two had better sit down and talk. Yes, sit down and talk. Renew the acquaintance of your early youth." "Your early youth," he repeated in a faint voice. "Those youthful friendships." He made a convulsive grimace, which Cosmo had discovered to be the effect of a smile. "There is something so charming in those youthful friendships. As to myself, I don't remember ever being youthful." He stepped out towards the door through which Cosmo had seen Clelia enter that morning. "Let me find you, when I return, enjoying yourselves most sentimentally. Most delightful." His long, stiff back swayed in the doorway, and the door came to with a crash. Cosmo and Adele looked at each other with a smile. Cosmo, hat in hand, added just audibly, "I suppose I had better stay?" She made an affirmative sign, and, moving away from him, put her foot on the marble fender of the fireplace, where nothing was left but hot ashes, hiding a reddish glow. Chapter 5. Cosmo, ill at ease, remained looking at her. He was in doubt what the sign she had made meant, a nervous and imperious gesture which might have been a command for him to go or to stay. In his irresolution, he gazed at her, thinking that she was lovely to an incredible degree, and that the word radiant applied to her extraordinary aptness. Light entered into her composition, and it was not the cold light of marble. She actually glows, he said to himself, amazed, like ripe fruit in the foliage, like a big flower in the shade. "Don't gaze at my blushes," said Madame de Monteveso in an even tone, tinged with a little mockery and a little bitterness. "Would you believe that when I was a girl, I was so shy that I used to blush crimson whenever anyone looked at me or spoke to me? It is a failing which does not meet with much sympathy, and yet my suffering was very real. It would reach such a pitch at times that I was ready to cry." "Shall I go away?" asked Cosmo in a deadened voice. He waited for a moment while she seemed to debate in her mind the answer to the question. In his fear of being sent away, he went on, "God knows I don't want to leave you, and after all, the Count is coming back, and—" "Oh, yes, he is coming back. Sit down. Yes, it would be better. Sit down." Cosmo sat down where he could see her admirable shoulders, the roundness of her averted head, coiffée en boucle, and girt with a gold circlet, the shadowy retreating view of her profile. The long drapery of her train flowed to the ground in a dark blue shimmer. "He is inevitable. He has always been inevitable," came further from her lips, which he couldn't see, for the mirror above the mantelpiece reflected nothing but her forehead with the gold mist of her hair above. Cosmo remained silent. For nothing in the world would he have made a sound. He held his breath with expectation, and in the extreme tension of his whole being the lights grew dim around him, while her white shoulders, the thick clustering curls, the arm on which she leaned, and the other bare arm, hanging inert by her side, seemed the only source of light in the room. "You don't know me at all," began the Countess de Monteveso. "I don't charge you with forgetting. But the little you may remember of me cannot be of any use. It is only natural that I should be a stranger to you. But you cannot be a stranger to me. For one thing, you were a boy, and then you were not a child of outcasts without a country, of refugees with a ruined past and with no future. You were a young Latham, as rooted in your native soil as the old trees of your park. Even then there seemed to me something enviable about you." She turned her head a little to glance at him. "You had no idea what it was like after we had gone to London. My ignorance of the world was so profound that I felt ill at ease in it. I hoped I had an attractive face, but I only discovered that I was pretty from the remarks of the people in the street I overheard. I spent my life by the side of my mother's couch. I never went out except attended by my father or by Aglaé. My only amusement was to play a game of chess now and then with an old doctor, also a refugee, who looked after my mother, or listen to the conversation of the people who came to see us. Amongst them there were all the prominent men and women of the old regime, refugees. They seldom spoke the truth to each other, and yet they were no more stupid than the rest of the world. Nobody could be more good-natured and better company, more frivolous. or more inconsiderate. I have seen women of the highest rank work 10 hours a day to get bread for their children, but they also slandered one another, told falsehoods about their conduct and their work, and quarreled among themselves in the style of washerwomen. Morals were even looser than in the times before the Revolution. Manners were forgotten. Every transgression was excused in those who were regarded as good royalists. I don't mean this to apply to the great body of the refugees. Some of them led irreproachable lives. Round our princes there were some most absurd intrigues. I didn't know much of all this, but I remember my poor father's helpless indignations, and my own appalled disgust at the things I could not help hearing and seeing. She turned her head to look at Cosmo. I am telling you all this to give you some idea of the air I had to breathe, she said in a changed tone. I don't think it contaminated me. I felt its odiousness. But all this seemed without remedy. I didn't even suffer much from it. What I suffered most from was our domestic anxieties. My mother's fears lest the small resources we had to live on should fail us altogether. Our daily crust of bread seemed to depend on political events in Europe, and they were going against us. Battles, negotiations, everything. A blight seemed to have fallen on the royalist cause. My mother didn't conceal her distress. What touched me more still was the careworn, silent anxiety of my poor father. She paused, looking at Cosmo intently, meeting his eyes fixed on her face. I was getting on for 16, she continued. No one ever paid the slightest attention to me. The only genuine passion in my heart was filial love. But is it any good in going on? And then I can't tell what you may have heard already. All I have heard, said Cosmo in a tone of profound respect, is that Adele de Monteveso's life has been irreproachable. I remember the time when all the world was doing its best to make it impossible. Would it shock you very much if I told you that I don't care at all about its good opinion now? There was a time when it would put the worst construction possible on my distress, on my bewilderment, on my very innocence. Why should the world do that to you? Asked Cosmo. Why? But I see you know nothing. I met my husband first at a select concert that was given by the music master of the late Queen of France. My mother was feeling a little better, and insisted on my going out a little. Those were small, fashionable affairs. I had a good voice myself, and that evening I sang with Madame Sepio. An English gentleman, his name doesn't matter, presented Monsieur de Monteveso to me as a friend of his just returned from India, and anxious to be introduced to the best society. What with my usual shyness and the unattractive appearance of the man, I don't think I received his attentions very well. There was really no reason I should notice him particularly. It wasn't difficult to see that he had not the manners of a man of the world. Where could he have acquired them? He had left his village at 17. He enlisted in the Irish regiment, which served in France. Then he deserted, perhaps. I only know that some years afterwards he was a captain in the service of Russia. From there he made his way to India. I believe the Governor-General used him as a sort of unofficial agent amongst the native princes, but he got into some scrape with the company. By what steps he managed to get on to the back of an elephant and command the army of a native prince, I really don't know. and even if I had known then, it would not have made him more interesting in my eyes. I was relieved when he made me a deep bow with his hand on his heart and went away. He left a most fugitive impression, but the very next morning he sent his English friend to ask my parents for my hand. That friend was a nobleman, a man of honor, and the offers he was empowered to make were so generous that my parents thought they must tell me of them. I was so astonished that at first I couldn't speak. I simply went away and shut myself up in my room. They were not people to press me for an answer. The poor worried dears thought that I wouldn't even consent to contemplate this marriage. While I, shut up in my room, I was afraid, remembering the way they had spoken to me of that offer, that they would reject it without consulting me any further. I sent word by Aglaé that I would give my answer next day, and that I begged to be left to myself. Then I escaped from the house, followed by Aglaé, who was never so frightened in her life, and went to see the wife of that friend of my present husband. I begged her to send at once for General de Monteveso. At that time he called himself General. The King of Sardinia had given him this rank in acknowledgment of some service that his great wealth had enabled him to render to the court of Turin. That lady, of course, had many scruples about doing something so highly unconventional, but at last, overcome by the exaltation of my feelings, she consented. "She did that?" murmured Cosmo. "What an extraordinary thing." "Yes, she did that. Instead of taking me home, people will do extraordinary things to please a man of fabulous wealth. She sent out 2 or 3 messengers to look for him all over the town. They were some time in finding him. I waited. I was perfectly calm. I was calmer than I am now, telling you my story. I was possessed by the spirit of self-sacrifice. I had no misgivings. I remember even how cold I was in that small drawing-room with a big coal fire. He arrived out of breath. He was splendidly dressed and behaved very ceremoniously. I felt his emotion without sharing it. I, who used to blush violently at the smallest provocation, didn't feel the slightest embarrassment in addressing that big, stiff man, so much older than myself. I could not appreciate what a fatal mistake I was committing by telling him that I didn't care for him in the least, and probably never should, but that if he would secure my parents' future comfort, my gratitude would be so great that I could marry him without reluctance, and be his loyal friend and wife for life. He stood there, stiff and ominous, and told me that he didn't flatter himself with the possibility of inspiring any deeper feeling. We stood there facing each other for a bit,